Okay, I think we're going to start in a few seconds. I'm supposed to count to 10, but I always rush through my counting, so I'll try and slow it down. Okay, let's go. Salam, namaste, hello. Welcome to our last session of the Summer of ISHQ, a series of 6 webinars brought to you by the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. My name is Madhavi Menon. I'm Professor of English and Director of the Center. We've had 5 sessions already on rights, law, politics, cinema, borders, and today our final session is on education. I'll briefly go through the format before introducing you to our wonderful speakers for today and the question that they will be tackling for us. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then they will spend another 10 minutes talking to one another. And then the last 30 minutes will be devoted to Q&A from the audience. So if you look at the panel at the bottom of your screen, there is a sign saying Q&A. Please click on that anytime in the first 30 minutes or 40 minutes. Post your question. Please keep your questions brief because we'd like to take as many questions as we possibly can. And that will be our entire hour. So today's session is going to be on education. And remember, our sort of rubric is Summer of ISHQ. And ISHQ, of course, as you all know, as a word, translates into love, desire, passion. And as the acronym that we have been using for our speaker series stands for Issues in Sexuality, History, and Queerness, that allows us to theorize and politicize that passion. So joining us today are 2 fabulous people, 2 of my favoriteest people in the world, Lee Edelman and Paromita Vohra, who will be tackling the question, what is a good education? Lee Edelman is Fletcher Professor of English at Tufts University. Paromita Vohra is a filmmaker, cultural critic, and creative director of the wonderful Agents of ISHQ website. And I think Paromita is going first. So Paromita, your 10 minutes starts.
Thank you, Madhavi. And it's great to be here with everybody as part of this wonderful series. I think the question of what is a good education really can maybe be rephrased to ask where is the good education, and we understand education to take place in institutional frameworks, and we see it as a kind of canonical practice of deciding what is worth studying, but also therefore that which is meaningful. And in that sense, education to a great extent, although it is sold to us and we think of it as something that helps inclusion, has an inherently exclusionary structure because it includes some things but continuously leaves some things out. And I think that a lot of what we have learned from Agents of ISHQ allows us to rethink what a good education could be, and also thrown a light on the limitations of what we traditionally think of as a good education, because we recognize that it's always something that is equipping us to have more access to a public understanding. It's education that thinks about empowerment or meaningfulness through visibility, through the testing of what you know. Whereas what we found is that there is actually a vast space that we could call the private parts of education. So can I have the first slide, Isha? For all of the things that in a way education doesn't teach you, which is to do with private life, which is to do with personal life, people nevertheless do educate themselves. And I think they do that in culture. And culture continuously has a kind of remix where people are making culture, but also learning from culture, but also contributing to culture. And this is the kind of education that is considered to be bad, because in fact, it is completely unruly. These places of education are traditionally seen as messy and the opposite of education, in fact, as the place where the uneducated enjoy themselves because they don't know any better. But I think that the hallmark of this place of education is that it's plentiful. It is always unending and uncountable. So some of the places where you see it is, for example, of course, pornography. You see it with Hindi film songs or film songs in general in India. You see it in people's fantasies. You see it through gossip. You see it in tabloids. You see a kind of unending discussion about life and learning about life in these spaces. And I think that the privacies that these private parts of education talk about are important because they are also what gets sanitized out of public life in a way, right? Our regional identities, our sexual differences, and most importantly, I think our emotional and experiential wisdom, which continuously gets seen as a place of lack. So that education is all about learning to conquer that private part of ourselves and to strip it of all its power in order to give more and more power to the public self in a way. But I think that the difficulty with this notion of the good education is, of course, that it only empowers the category of education. It doesn't actually empower the people it's claiming that it's going to empower, right? And so all the other things that are part of us start to become the bad thing about us, the thing that we start to feel ashamed of. So I think in that sense, Agents of Ishq, what it's shown us is that when you give people a space to sort of co-create their own education, you have to enter the place of culture. And this place is not countable. It's not enumeratable in any ways. You can't test if people have learned, and you can't test if you have taught. So in some sense, it's a completely open-ended and completely unstable place. I think that people are very aware that it's a place of education, but it's not a place they feel confident of. They don't feel that it's an education which equips them to be confident to say things about the world. Can we see the next slide? So many of the slides that I'm going to show you are from what people have said on Agents of Ishq about where they learn things, right? So what Imran Hashmi, Indians would know, is a movie star of a kind of B movie, and he's known as a serial kisser. His films are usually very sexy and very pulpy. And for many people, this kind of a world educates them in their own feelings and in who they are, but it's something that they have to continuously curate and hide and lose confidence in. Can I show the next slide? Can we have the next slide? This is Savita Bhabhi, who was a very popular porn figure. And this image is actually from an article contributed by a person who wrote about writing some Savita Bhabhi stories. Now, George Michael, the sex ed teacher we never had, everybody in the world knows why he's our favorite sex ed teacher. Can we see the next slide? So I think actually important.
We seem to have lost Paromita, but hopefully she'll be back soon. Until then, we can gaze our fill upon the image on the screen in front of us. And there's a lot to gaze upon. Ishan, if you could just sort of text Paromita and check if she's going to be coming back on, that would be good. How does she even put these images together? I don't know. Lee, I know you are also a master at putting images like this together. So maybe that's the next workshop we can have. The two of you teach people how to put together PowerPoint slides or images for PowerPoint slides, especially sexy ones.
Well, Paramita is a filmmaker, so she has the capacity to do it wonderfully.
Yes, absolutely. She certainly has the skills. Well, let us hope she comes back soon.
I'm sure that she has the technical skills if the power is still on in Bombay.
That's the problem. I think that's the problem we'll have to deal with. I think we wait for a minute. Otherwise, we could just sort of start with you, Lee, or resume with you, and hope that she'll be able to come back somehow 10 minutes later. And if not, then you can have her time too, which I know sometimes is good news for other panelists, but sometimes not. So we can see.
I think I am looking forward to Paramita's return because I want to hear what she is going to, the end of this narrative.
Exactly. And Ishan, I'm going to wait to hear from you about what we should do.
She's just trying to connect using her phone. So
okay.
Yeah, let's hope it works.
So hopefully it will succeed. How perverse for the power to go out just today, just now in Bombay. I think they know, because they know this is being hosted in Delhi, they the traditional rivalry between the cities means that this is what they want to do.
Well, Madhavi, you can hardly complain of perversity.
Um, well, I hope her phone works.
I suspect that it will.
Yeah? Okay, good.
If Ishan was able to contact her through
Yeah.
text messaging, then
Yeah.
there must be a connection.
Right. So Ishan should probably have to go back to the link and log back in, yes?
Yeah, I think it should work.
Okay. Such a tantalizing slide she's left us with as well. But anyway.
It seems fitting that this should happen on the session on education.
Thereby giving the lie to the idea of a good education.
Apparently, there have been an entire series of online memes about problems in education online during the COVID crisis. So this seems like a fitting commentary on the state of the world we're inhabiting.
Maybe it'll just get added to that repertory.
Let's hope not.
So Paramita's asked Lee to go ahead,
Okay.
and she'll try and join in the meanwhile.
Okay. Well, so then can we get get out of the PowerPoint? Great. So Lee, I'm sorry, I know this is not ideal, but thank you for stepping in, and we will get back to Paromita hopefully very soon. So please, Lee, all yours.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I just want to say that Paromita sent me before we spoke an outline of what she was going to be talking about. So I've incorporated some of her thoughts into my response. And so the narrative trajectory will be that I will be responding to her ideas before some of you have had the chance to hear them. But that seems perfectly appropriate in thinking about education and queerness.
Right.
So I want to start by thanking Madhavi and Ishan and Shiv and Alankrita for their superb work in putting together this series of conversations. I'm going to be thinking a bit about the trajectory of this series in my opening remarks. So I hope all of you have been watching regularly and making the most of these provocative exchanges. There won't be a test, but it will be helpful. But before I use the thinking about this webinar series to exemplify the argument that I'm going to be making, I also want to thank Paramita, who began to provide us a few minutes ago, and in her remarks to me, provided me with an extremely compelling framework for thinking about sexuality, education, and the good. And as you will see, my remarks are going to completely endorse her diagnosis of the context in which queerness and education must be thought, because her presentation coincides in many ways with my own ideas about what I'm calling in my forthcoming book, Bad Education, pedagarchivalization, which is to say the construction of subjects as archives for the preservation and transmission of meanings. The educational project in the root sense is a conservative project, and it constitutes the horizon of our being as subjects, because our subjectivity is first and foremost our attachment to a learned aesthetic of coherence based on an internalized self-image, a fantasy of totalization or unity. And as subjects, we all of us cling to that image, even if we seem to turn against it, since our agency is bound to that image of ourselves as acting in accord with our own will, despite the limits, social and psychic limits, on what that notion of autonomy means. Above and beyond any content, then, education, the education that subjectifies us, is an education that inducts us into a universe of sense, into a system of meanings by which reality and the world come into being. I say that they come into being advisedly because education produces being. It generates ontology. And it does so, as Hamlet famously reminds us, by enforcing a separation between to be and not to be. The reality of the world appears to us through an education in subjectivity that attaches us to it, to the world, but also to ourselves. not so much by colonizing us, since we don't exist before that colonization, but by shaping us into its minions, making us creatures ontologically dependent upon difference, articulation, and meaning, the mechanisms by which we recognize ourselves and our relation to the objects around us. What before this educational formation was merely a creature of the drive or of instinct becomes after it a human subject seeing a world that is only visible through the imposition of a screen of meaning. That's why the French psychoanalyst Lucien Israel can insist that education is education against the drive, that it generates the subject within a logic of exchange that forces us to enter into a community of desire at odds with the drive. But that means, as queer theory, Afro-pessimism, feminism, critical race studies, and disability studies have variously shown us, that some subjects discover through that acculturation that they remain outside the ambit of the human community, that the education that is education against the drive reads them as figures of the drive itself, of what the ontology of the human must escape. Structurally, such persons are positioned as queer, which is to say strange, unusual, unfamiliar, non-normative from the viewpoint of a given social order. Wherever they appear within the dominant reality for which they embody non-being, they seem to perform a sort of violent counter-pedagogy that seems to make present what is not, what is ontologically excluded from reality, what's outside the order of meaning. They seem to promote a bad education, one that rejects the dominance of reality itself. The various legal and social prohibitions that constrain those queered lives to embody the condition of non-being and non-meaning continuously enact the educational imperative to sublimate the force of the drive, to elicit meaning where meaning wasn't, to preserve and transmit the world. Now, Paromita, in beginning to think about the private parts of education, is recognizing this problem and also beginning to suggest an alternative to it, an alternative that consists of the sorts of spaces in which it might be possible to offer a different sort of education. And I think that's what she will continue to talk about when she returns to her presentation. In that sense, I think she's going to actually provide us with a perfect way to bring the Summer of ISHQ to an end, since one of the things that she's thinking about is how to disrupt the normalization of the pedagogical mandate with the multiplicity of meanings condensed in the word ISHQ itself, the multiplicity of meanings that Madhavi spoke of in her introduction and that she exemplifies so eloquently in her recent book, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India. And as much as I'm drawn to these insurgent accounts of a bad education, or what, to use a word Paromita used a minute ago, an unruly education would be, as much as I'm drawn to accounts that would displace, say, singularity with multiplicity, or knowing with not knowing, or questions with answers with questions, I'm also, and respectfully, a bit wary of this as one more ruse of meaning itself. In fact, if we look over the earlier discussions in this wonderful series of webinars, it's striking how regularly the counter-normative pedagogies of ISHQ have enacted such recuperations. In the discussion of rights, for example, the question of individual rights was usefully complicated by thinking about the social justice imperative of thinking rights in collective terms. But in this way, queerness was deployed to shore up a social structure from which at first it was excluded. This compels us to ask if queerness can ever be a principle of value in social organization, or if it doesn't refer to what such organization, regardless of its form, rejects. That same question appeared in a different way in the next week's discussion of law, where the claim for sexual minorities, including those who identify themselves as queer, was made to hinge on the right to privacy as a question not of bourgeois space, but of the dignity of the person. But given that the dignity of the person is precisely the framework that inspired prohibitions on unnatural sexual relations in the first place, since they were seen as assaults on that dignity, can that category really accommodate queerness? Or can it only normalize what at a given moment no longer counts as queer? In the subsequent session on bodies, where the body's legibility was inflected by nationalistic discourses, queerness emerged as the political hope of liberating stigmatized bodies from their status as vulnerable or killable and according them their proper place in the framework of humanist meanings. And this hope was repeated the following week when the discussion of cinema affirmed the possibility of a specifically queer cinema that would make queer worlds or curate images to generate queer meanings. Once again, the putative queerness of those worlds constrains queerness into an identity that generates meanings of its own, thus keeping intact the system of world making that rests, whoever is making that world, on the law of meaning, and so on the exclusion of what threatens the order of meaning as such. This reached a sort of culmination last week in the fascinating discussion of borders, where the speakers made powerful cases for wildness, disorder, and bewilderment over and against the certitudes and the logic of civilization. Even here, though, by advocating wildness so persuasively, the speakers, far from seeming bewildered, instantiated a new version of certitude and wound up arguing on behalf of a wildness imagined as self-controlling, as not too wild. It must include no tendency to colonize or to dominate, for example, thus making it an eminently civilized version of wildness after all. The contradictions that all of these brilliant speakers confront aren't indices of failure. They're not something that could have been avoided. They testify instead to the inevitable problem that queerness poses for every attempt to define, to affirm, and to positivize it. Queerness is not ontological. Like blackness, as discussed so powerfully by Afro-pessimists such as Frank Wilderson or Calvin Warren or Saidiya Hartman or David Marriott, it is what ontology forecloses in order to come into being. We can certainly, as Paromita is suggesting, experience sensations that trouble the imperative of meaning, that just don't add up or that are fleeting, untidy, or uncountable. But when we conceptualize them as liberating or queer, as inherently resistant to the world that is given, we're recuperating them for the very meaningfulness that we want them to disrupt. That's the double bind to which we're led by queer negativity. It can never produce a world because it functions as a critique of worlding, a critique that points to the empty set within every reading of queerness that we offer. All of these brilliant contributions to Summer of ISHQ's educational enterprise, including my own, can only allegorize, can only cast in the form of meaning the vanishing of queerness from every positive representation. The promise of collective rights, of privacy and dignity, of liberated bodies, of queer worlds of meaning, of a non-imperialistic wildness, of constant expenditure, of a bad education. These are the key words in the textbook of queerness that might accompany this series of webinars. But an education that could generate such a textbook risks seeming more normative than queer. And that for me is precisely the difficulty of thinking queerness with education. Queerness as world disturbance, as insistence on what is constitutively excluded, cannot eventuate in a new order, a fixed practice, or a liberatory ideal. Queerness demands what few of us really want to give, a rigorously structural account of both the subject and the social order, and an understanding that from within that structure, we are all agents of a good education, that we all affirm the recuperation of the orthodoxies that we enforce, even if we call it queer, because in the end, we're all pedagogists.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was absolutely brilliant and lots of food for thought. Welcome back, Paromita. I hope you'll be able to watch the recording of what you missed, because Lee said lovely things about you and the first couple of slides. But shall we just jump right back in, because we're already running a bit late. Ishan, if you can get us right back to that slide. Paromita, please go ahead.
So, I think I'm also going to take up from where I left off, but also adding to what Lee said in a way, that this profound contradiction of the teachable moment becoming too fixed. In a sense, I think culture destabilizes it. And I think that in a sense, it is an education which is not educational, so to speak, right? It's expressive. But it also allows us to think outside this binary of public and private, which often informs many of the ideas of power and disempowerment that we talk about, or that which is hidden, that which is allowed and not allowed. And I think it actually diversifies it into the idea of the public, the private, and the personal being a place where the public and the private are continuously being remixed at will in context. So it is inherently an unstable category, which we need to feed as much as we can into, such that the private, which is unstable, the public, which is changing, are not the things that necessarily define what we can be. But the personal, which continuously mixes the two, also changes those two. And I think that is why the gathering of many, many experiential encounters within a semi-educational framework, which we began to do in Agents of ISHQ, actually, it is both educational and not, because it actually has no lesson to offer. Most of the accounts are really about what I felt at a certain moment and what I learned from it. A lot of the accounts also are, in a sense, meaningless except for being fun. So they don't allow the fixing of meaning to come into anything. But what they do provide, I think, is a kind of muscularity of being. And this muscularity of being has so many open-ended meanings that I feel, yes, it has all the niceness of education that Lee is quite rightly critiquing, in that it makes us strong and strong enough to traverse the world. But in some ways, it also keeps us very flexible and fluid, and allows us to think about education not as a way of knowing everything, but how to exist in the unknown, how to exist in a time and a self which is continuously fleeting, and think about contact of the intellect, of the emotion, and of the body in terms of several fleeting intimacies that are continuously following on each other. And I think what it also does is therefore continuously throws up new questions which dissolve old categories. Can we go to the next slide? So, I mean, while some of these accounts may speak directly to the kind of public political discussion that happens, say, around Me Too or sexual harassment, or what sexual experience for women is like, and violence, by replacing those kind of syllabi or curricula of politics with experiences that people have, there are also actually, can you go to the next question, next slide? There are ways in which, of course, yes, this kind of formal pedagogy is rewritten and exists in the formal space, in a very kind of orthodox space. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Skip this one. And for example, this article about whether to be truly sex positive, we have to step away from talking about sex altogether, which sort of dissolves this category of the sex positive sex education that we are all supposed to be seeking. Next. Or the idea of struggling with being sexual, not homosexual, that a fairly successful queer artist might bring up, which continuously takes the thing which is empowering you, so to speak, and then doubts it and searches for a new becoming. Next. And I think, in a way, I think that a lot of these things, because they're also expressed in non-programmatic terms, they come in a language that draws on all the private, not good parts of education and culture, of English and Hindi mixed, of popular culture, of things that are looked down on, like Rupi Kaur, or Hindi films, or that which is plentiful and easily available in a way, and hence not worth having almost, giving it a kind of fleeting meaning only, not fixing its meaning. So I do feel that there is something to be maybe learned from this kind of an encounter with a self-education within sexual life that throws some doubt on what might be our interpretations of queerness and education both, and of course of good.
Was that the last slide, Paromita?
Yes, that is the last slide. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. Paromita, it's good to have you back. Lee, thank you so much for stepping in. Unfortunately, though, this means we have to forego the 10-minute cross chat and go straight to the Q&A from the audience, but that's fine. You can cross-chat with during your Q&A session. So Ishan will come on now to curate that section for us. And in an attempt to take as many questions as possible, I would encourage you to be as succinct as you can in order to make your points. Ishan, all yours.
Thank you so much for those presentations. So we have a first question which picks up from both of your presentations, and I'll just read it out. I'm curious about whether the speakers differentiate education and culture. What exactly is education? Does it refer just to formal education specifically, or is it something closer to culture more broadly? What might be at stake in thinking about or blurring this distinction? And this is addressed to both of you, so either of you can go first.
Shall I respond? Well, I think that there is a distinction to be made between what we call formal education, or spaces where we are involved in an educational process, hoping to learn something, hoping to teach something, and culture, which is always imparting lessons, but not always hoping to teach and learn in quite the same systematic way. And so there's more place for chance encounters in culture. There's more place for covert expression, and there's more place for chance taking, I think, in culture, which leads to all kinds of interesting intellectual collisions. And actually, I also want to say that I'm not proposing that one way supplants the other at all. I actually think that both the ways need to coexist, and that we should have the freedom to go from one space to the other and take our learnings as we like. I'm not suggesting that culture should now replace a formal education. In fact, that would defeat its purpose.
Yeah, I guess I would argue that I certainly am not interested in suggesting that education refers exclusively or even primarily to so-called formal education in an institutional framework, except to the extent that all of us as subjects are shaped in the institutional frameworks that start with, for instance, for most of us, though not all, the family. And therefore, all of those institutions are part of the education that is acculturation, that is the education and how the world is meant to mean. And to that extent, I think one of the interesting suggestions that Paromita has been offering us is that one that I don't wholly concur with, but I think is important and smart and provocative, is that in cultural products and in cultural forms, we can recognize the tensions within the educational system, and we have the possibility for seeing spaces of conflict rather than the appearance of coherence that is one of the ambitions of most other spaces of educational normalization and acculturation. I'm not fully persuaded that that allows us to escape, even in those cultural products, the acculturating normativity that I was talking about, but I do think that it makes the aesthetic in particular a space where we can begin to think about contestation.
Right. The next question is again addressed to both the panelists. Do we need education for there to be queerness, in as much as queerness is always outside the parameters of education? I think this picks up directly from your presentation, Professor Lee.
What we need for there to be queerness is a stigmatizing structure. What we need for there to be queerness is a normative society, which is to say what we need is a social order. Where there is a social order, there will be queerness. Where there's a social order, there's also education. Since social order is only possible, is only promulgated, is only transmitted, is only by turning us into its archives. We're all the archives of the social order that are shaped for its transmission. To that extent, where there is such a social order, we are inculcated into practices of meaning making, which then queer what doesn't fall within the ambit of the ontological, of the valuable, of the meaningful. Insofar as that structure obtains, there are those who are always going to be consigned to the place of non-being and of non-meaning, and are going to be conceived not as, to use Gail Rubin's term, just benign variations, but as radical threats to the structure by which society perpetuates itself. That means that the force of exclusion is constitutive with the framework of social order. And what we need to think about is how we can use queerness as a concept that is always going to be a self-contradictory concept, because by framing it as a concept, we're precisely attempting to give it an identity as the figure for that which has no identity, which resists the coherence of meaning that the society is prescribing.
Right. Paromita, would you like to respond to that as well?
I mean, I agree, but I also think that actually the idea of a queer education, which sometimes is spoken about, say, within activism, is, of course, always profoundly unqueer in that sense, right? Because it puts down such a strict syllabus of what you are supposed to know, and that you must always demonstrate that knowing through some kind of public articulation, which I think in an experiential way, I would say that on Agents of Age, sometimes when narratives come in, which don't clearly fit into any politically correct category of queerness, but from an identity which is seen as queer, they can attract a lot of stigma because they don't fit into what is this progressive ideal that you're continuously supposed to replay. So I think that that what it does lead to, however, is this kind of desire to dissolve the category. So in some sense, what Lee is saying, the kind of conflict and tension that arises from it makes the category meaningless at all times. And so I think it does become difficult to call something, to label something queer, and then to reproduce it in that way. It automatically doesn't have any meaning. Right. And to that extent, I do think that the emotions and to use the emotional and experiential space continuously to inform the aesthetic of something prevents it from being so clearly defined, and that I do find helpful.
Right. So just picking up from that as well, and you've both touched upon the role that art plays, for instance, in education. So can we also think of art's relationship to queerness and talk about what, for instance, an aesthetic education might yield in terms of making a good education?
Should I respond?
Sure.
Sure.
I mean, I think that, the desire to use the arts to uplift ourselves is always a very kind of fraught desire. At the same time, the desire to see art as only trash, I feel, is a useless kind of pursuit, right? But I do think that an aesthetic education, in the sense that we recognize that everything is merely an aesthetic, is simply one fantasy or another fantasy that plays out that we consume, is actually helpful. And it's, to use a totally non-academic word, very relaxing. Because, I mean, I would take the example of a show like Indian Matchmaking, which has currently got everybody in a ferment, right? And that some people who critique it genuinely believe that the world that they live in is not a construct. And so critique the construct that Indian Matchmaking is presenting. Whereas the fantasy of being progressive, or even of having a progressive version of the patriarchy by your cooler, woker marriage, this is also a fantasy, and that is also a fantasy and a construct and fakeness. So I think at some level, what an aesthetic education can do is give us an appreciation and a knowingness about structures, about stylization of life, and may just make us chill out a little bit more politically, and also perhaps emotionally and psychologically feel a little bit more at home with whatever is happening to us in the moment, right? And by the moment, I mean that every experience and everything that happens is not outcome oriented. So it is not going towards a goal, but in fact is understood for a certain aesthetic experience that we are choosing to go through. And that also raises the question that came up actually in the discussion in Shohini's and Gayatri Gopinath's discussion about queerness. Where should we feel that queerness? In a film that is denoted as queer, or do we want it in this covert fashion in that larger, baggy and capacious kind of Bollywood film where it is queer, but we don't really know? I think we should be able to choose between those two actually as aesthetic things and maybe have both.
Right.
I think there's a lot to recommend in what Paromita has just said. I think that that the aesthetic can operate in ways that induce a variety of sensations and feelings that can help to accommodate us to a world that does not accommodate us, can help to disorient the overly oriented logics by which the world operates. At the same time, however, the aesthetic as a category is one that I'm also wary of. And I'm wary of it because largely the aesthetic, at least in the Western tradition, has been predicated on relations to, and to go back to the question as you read it, Ishan, to questions of the good. So that aesthetic and goodness are linked to each other insofar as they create a lining up of formal totality, coherence, beauty, and good feeling. And the aesthetic in that sense leads us beyond ourselves. The problem with that, of course, is that the opposite of the aesthetic is always something like the obscene. It's always something like the ugly. It's always something that is grotesque or does not fit in. Now, you can produce an aesthetic of the grotesque, but even in producing an aesthetic of the grotesque, you're simply reconfiguring your parameters of what is acceptable within the discourses of totality and beauty. So the question of the aesthetic always prompts us to ask whether or not we can accommodate, whether or not we can acknowledge, and what we can do with those feelings that resist the idea of the good, those feelings that are not going to benefit us, that are not going to add up to anything, that are not going to teach us anything, and that are not useful for us, let alone for others. Part of the problem for me, given that I operate within a psychoanalytic framework, is that all of these notions of the aesthetic and of education presuppose the malleability and educability of a subject conceived as a conscious subject. And in opposition to that conscious subject, there is always that which is repressed by such consciousness, and that in its power to disrupt the coherence of the subject of meaning gets produced as the other of our aesthetic of totalization.
Ishan, can I just sort of jump in for 1 second here?
Sure.
Just to pick up on the term that both Lee and Paromita used explicitly and implicitly, which is fantasy. And I'm just wondering if we can speak just for a couple of minutes about fantasy, especially since in its inability to be sort of drawn into a totalitarian narrative, it's currently not fashionable at all, especially among educational circles. I mean, I find increasingly that students are skeptical about fantasy or suspicious about fantasy. They look at it as the opposite of politics or the opposite of reality. And both of you are trying to sort of push us into thinking about fantasy. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about how you think, why you think the rejection is happening, how you think that might ever change or not. So either one can start.
I think, in a sense, it's connected to what Lee just said, his hesitation about the aesthetic as being this place of good and also of coherence at some level. And I do think, I was thinking as he spoke that in Indian aesthetic, and especially popular Indian aesthetic, but even classical aesthetic sometimes, there is this habit of cataloging, right? There are so many lists. The Kama Sutra has lists of types of kisses and types of women and types of things. And I find this very interesting and, this kind of dense aesthetic, which is called ornamental, but in fact seems to accommodate big, small, and very, very varied things somehow in some one capacious place, which the fantasy film, as it was called, or the highly psychologically and emotionally charged cinema that we all partook of for many years, which now has this kind of sanitized aesthetic, right, of realism, where realism is the aesthetic that is seen as superior and truthful and somehow more political because it's telling you things as it is. It is a plain, unvarnished truth. And in fact, it supposes, I always think that liberal is wrongly spelled and should be spelled literal, because there is something about this literalism that it pushes, this idea of realism, that is very opposite to the sophistications of fantasy, if one may. And that is also why the argument for a kind of film which has many, many, many different aesthetics coexisting in it, none being really superior. We're not even very sure which is subverting which. In a Hindi film, are the songs subverting the conservative narrative, or is the conservative narrative undercutting the fantasy of and the libidinal kind of craziness of the song? This is unknowable. And there's also presupposition that, which I think, yes, it is a kind of colonial understanding of that aesthetic, which transfers onto liberal elites in India, that those who consume fantasy are so stupid that they will think fantasy is reality. This is something I experienced because I read a lot of Mills and Boons when I was a young girl. And I was always being told, such an intelligent girl like you will, get the wrong ideas. And I'm like, thank God I got the wrong ideas, right? So did you really think that I believed everything I was reading? I had the ability to distance, or maybe not, whatever. Some alchemy occurred. So I think it is also similar with realism. Realism is only an aesthetic. But those who are consuming realism think it is real, and they do not recognize it as an aesthetic. But they transpose this kind of literalism onto other people, which I think is very interesting. And it is, of course, it is simply another kind of wonderful mixture of capitalism and caste and elite educations coming together to sort of sanitize culture. And very quickly, I just want to say that we've seen the same thing happening in India with TikTok being banned. TikTok was this kind of very rambunctious and unruly space, and now replaced by the far neater, far more countable, and also revenue creatable spaces like Reels or Facebook Shorts, which are something that elites can use more comfortably, where they don't have to compete with the masses.
I think the point that Paromita just made is wonderful, especially in your discussion of literalization, because this production of the world in its literality is precisely how education generates what we take to be reality itself. So that the ontological status of the world is constructed through this process of literalizing figures of being and of non-being, and taking them for actualities rather than figures, for structures that generate within subjects fantasies. Now, for psychoanalysis, especially for Lacanian psychoanalysis, reality itself, the symbolic, is structured through fantasy. So that it's not that fantasy is the other of reality. Reality is the collective fantasy which we live. And so to go to the other sense of fantasy that both Madhavi and I think Paromita were invoking, sort of fantasy films or fantasy texts, whether they be science fiction or romance, whatever it may be, those fantasy structures are conceptualized as deviating from the reality of the world as it is, the same way queerness is conceptualized as deviating from the reality of the world as it is. But that means that what they're really doing is they're exposing the logic of fantasy that structures the world as it is. And insofar as they expose the gaps or incompletions within what we take to be the consistent framework of reality, they make it clear that it's only a framework, and that within that framework, we only see what we see as meaningful because of the way in which it has been, as it were, pulled over our eyes.
Thank you.
Right. So the next question is again for both of you. The critique of meaning seems to leave little room for patience, which is always for practice, sorry, which is always already partly ontological. So Professor Lee, is there any room for practice in your formulation, real work in the world? And Paromita, how do you see the importance of practice in your work rather than purely theory or critique?
Well, of course, there is always the contradiction between the critique of worlding and the aspiration to change the world. The question here, in a certain way, it could be focused in thinking about, to put it in the contemporary US historical moment, about the response to the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter? On the one hand, clearly within a practice of social organization, one wants to say that Black lives have value, and that those lives which have been continuously consigned to non-meaning and non-being should be brought into the orbit of meaning and being. They should be recognized. But at the same time, that only becomes possible by acceding to the logic of meaningful lives as framed by the very white value system that those Black lives are devalued by, which is why critiques of structural racism by critics like those who are part of the Afro-pessimist movement, suggest that if you're really going to think about structural racism, you can't simply have political transformation or juridical transformation, that the problem is built into the structure of the social order itself. And that's why in the series of conversations that Frank Wilderson and Saidiya Hartman said, the only alternative is to destroy the world. Of course, that's a self-consuming fantasy. One can't destroy the world because we are part of the world that we want to destroy. And it's not as if one can say, let's make a revolution. And that revolution is going to change the structure, because the revolution is simply going to be, as the very word's etymology suggests, a return to the logic of the structure. In fact, one can think about this problem, and I know nothing about what I'm about to say except what I've read in a few essays that I looked at before this week. We can think about that in relation to the word ishq itself. There's apparently a controversy about the etymology of the word ishq, but some of its etymological formations link it back to a root that means to stick or to cleave to, and link it to an ivy-like vine that is apparently has a related name. In that sense, even though it's associated with a madness of passionate intensity, there's also something that sticks, that clings. And in a certain sense, what we see is the structure is what we stick to, even in trying to think about ishq as a disruptive force of passionate separation.
I mean, I think to respond to this idea of practice and the idea of ishq as a disruptive force, which I don't think of it so much as perhaps. And I think it's very interlinked to the idea of practice. And I would actually use the word practice in a literal sense, to do all the time, to learn, and what that renders each time. And I think that some of this idea of the plentiful, taking many selfies, singing many songs, being Lata Mangeshkar, who sings many, 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 many songs, so that you continuously find many other versions of Lata Mangeshkar inside the notion that she is this kind of adolescent voice of the pure Indian woman, etc. Right? I think that somehow there is a lot of place for practice as a way of interacting with the world, but also with others, and bringing only parts of ourselves together in one place to do something. And I think at least with filmmaking or with those practices which require many people to come together and do something, I do think that for a fleeting moment, it allows you to imagine this coherence, right? But it does what Lee is in a way suggesting. It gives you an imagined moment of coherence, which immediately becomes, its meaning is gone once it's done. So you have to practice it again, and you have to practice it again. And I think in that sense, its relationship to ishq is also very interesting, because to be passionately committed to an idea, which is quite the opposite of the way that we are told a disruptive notion of relationality can be thought of, right? We'll have polyamory, or we will be against heteronormativity. But actually the idea of a commitment to some set of feelings or ideas, and the willingness to sculpt from them some shape for the time being, I think that is what practice allows for. And I think, therefore, it renders meanings, but doesn't fix them necessarily.
Right. So the next question is for Paromita, and I think it just deep dives into the question of practice itself. How can we problematize workshops on queerness, gender, and sexuality as a means of informal education? How can they be kept from becoming pedagogical, normative, or label endorsing and constructive? And this is something that we are also, as a center, personally interested in, because we do these workshops as well and constantly grapple with this question.
Okay, it's my favorite kind of question to get, because I hate workshops of those kinds, right? And when we started doing Agents of Ishq, I chanced upon a phrase that was marvelous. I think it taught me a lot, and it was emotional resilience workshop. And I said, what is that? And they were like, we do workshops with kids in our organization, and we tell them all these ideas of rebellion, and then they don't really know how to enact that in their regular lives. So we need to give them some emotional resilience to make sense of these radical ideas that we are telling them. I found this very novel, and I started to think about it a bit more. And then actually I worked with my colleague Hansa Thapliyal, who is a wonderful filmmaker and thinker. And we started doing these workshops where people would record podcasts on their own stories. But these stories were not just like, vomited out as, oh, this happened to me, and so I am a subject of worth in this political meaning making of the workshop. But rather they would be written. We did artistic workshops where they learned about metaphor and they learned about simile and they thought about describing themselves and each other in certain ways. And I think that there is a kind of cathartic meaning to making work in a sense. And I think that workshops cannot be, the number of workshops we attended while shaping Agents of Ishq over the years to understand what we should and should not try to do in our own work, I think do show that they are always a passive kind of experience for the people in the workshop. The members, the participants of the workshop are supposed to show that they have learned and have now become revolutionized subjects by always saying in public what is most private to them. When we spoke to young people, we found that actually there were subjects to discuss in public easily. For example, gender-based violence. There were subjects they discussed only with a few people and subjects they never discussed with anybody. And those were usually subjects about desire, masturbation, falling in love, etc. So I think that workshops can be problematized by thinking of what is it that the person does not need to say. What is it that the person in the workshop does not need to tell us? And how can we actually nourish that part and let them do what they want to do with it? Which is where I think the arts have a strong role to play. And the creating of stories together, or the making of beautiful things together actually makes some kind of a difference. I'm very scared of saying all that in front of Lee, but okay, I did it.
So, time for one question, Ishan?
So the next question is for Professor Lee. As you have pointed out in one of your essays, that the neoliberal impulse to catalyze the humanities to understand difference can often lead to the violence of inclusive exclusion, right? But how might we think of humanities as a means to confront differences without erasing them?
To confront, I'm sorry, I missed the one word. To confront what without erasing them? Differences?
Differences without erasing them. Yeah.
Well, we can easily do that if we're invested in a good educational enterprise. I mean, I think that's what almost all progressive versions of education and queerness seem to offer us. And a possibility of embracing differences, of celebrating differences, of making the inclusion of differences the hallmark of our success as subjects. And indeed, one of the things that has often been leveled as a critique of the progressive community or progressive communities is precisely the normalization of that embrace of difference. From my point of view, it's not so much that the problem is the normalization of the embrace of difference, is that the embrace of difference is usually only nominal. That the embrace of difference on a cognitive level is not at all the same thing as the embrace of difference on a, to go back to Paromita's terms, an emotional level or on an affective level. Difference is not neutral. That is to say that in a culture, a social order, differences present us with real possibilities of disturbance. And the humanity's version of differences, that is simple pluralism, fails to acknowledge precisely the intensity of attachment to one's own identity that can make differences truly threatening. And even where we accede to the discourse of embracing difference, usually that embrace of difference is correlative to a certain sense of superiority gained by the fact that we are now those who can embrace difference. We're smarter than or more human than the right-wing imbeciles who are so insular and so anxious in their identities. But we're just as anxious and insular in ours. It's just that we've made our embrace of difference the hallmark of our identity. And now we've simply made them, the right-wing imbeciles, into the ones whom we can excoriate as different.
Well, we're at the end of our hour, unfortunately. Part of me wishes I could say, and we'll be back next week, same day, same time with X. But part of me is really happy that I can't say that, because really there is nothing that can top this. So thank you both so much, Paromita Vohra, Lee Edelman. You were both fantastic, fabulous, provocative, and have really given us a lot to think about, a lot to argue about. And I can only hope that, and I know for a fact, that many, many thousands of people will be watching this video over time on YouTube as well. So thank you both for being such stars. And Paromita, I'm glad your electricity came back. Lee, I'm glad you were able to jump back in. Wonderful to have you both. Thanks everybody for attending, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.